to examine the United Nations, one of the great Canadian sacred cows. And as far as I'm concerned, whatever it was when it was started, a gleam of idealism in a world that was just out of the Second World War, it has become an entirely different kind of enterprise today. And Marissa is going to take a number of speakers through those differences. This is Marissa Semkiw.
So we've been talking about disruptive ideas. And so hopefully the next session causes many of you to rethink an institution that has been like motherhood and apple pie, an institution that we dare not criticize, and that is the UN, as Moses said. Now, of course, the UN was established in the immediate aftermath of World War II, and it was created by a small group of democratic countries. Now, we can discuss the merits or lack thereof of a global government. In fact, John Robson will come out shortly and talk about that. But the important thing is that at inception, the countries that formed the UN were united in their principles and in their purpose. Today, this is an institution that has ballooned to nearly 200 countries and is controlled by some of the world's worst regimes. These are non-democratic, totalitarian, thug, criminal regimes. That is the UN. And so as a result, this is an institution that has not lived up to its own ideals. This is an institution that I believe is where good ideas go to die. Look no further than the Human Rights Council, which is comprised of some of the world's worst human rights violators: Saudi Arabia, China, Cuba, Venezuela. Have you seen what's going on in Venezuela? And of course, it's obsessed with Israel, the only democratic country in its region. And so, and actually I read earlier today, an estimated 200 million girls and women have been subjected to genital mutilation by 30 UN member states. And so, as a result, this is an institution that is getting a more critical look. Donald Trump recently threatened to cut funding in the billions. The Israeli Prime Minister has said that certain affiliated bodies should be dismantled. And so we'll discuss just that. Is this an institution that should be dismantled? Should it be replaced? Each of the next few speakers have expressed varying degrees of criticism of this institution. And so I'll invite the first speaker on stage now, and that's Aurel Braun. He's a professor at the University of Toronto in the field of international relations and political science, a fierce and outspoken critic of the UN. Let's invite him to the stage.
Having been introduced as fierce, I better say that my preference, my very strong preference, is for an international system that is governed by international legality, that has strong and workable institutions. Now let me speak about the UN. The United Nations has become a gigantic organization with splendid headquarters, virtually universal membership in the world, 193 members, a vast budget, and it has a virtual army of first responders to basically counter any criticism, certainly any questioning of the legitimacy of this organization. And those first responders are placed in government, in the media, and in the academe, and many of them are extremely well-intentioned individuals, but they are dealing with a highly problematic organization. In 2005, when the UN was celebrating its 60th anniversary, then Canadian Prime Minister Paul Martin solemnly intoned that Canada cannot see the world succeeding without the United Nations. And whenever one criticizes the legitimacy of the organization? The answer often will be, if we did not have the UN, we would need to invent it. It is both a retort and a challenge. Well, we have the UN, and the world is not succeeding. Not in Iraq, not in Syria, not in Afghanistan, not in Sudan, not in Yemen, not in the Democratic Republic of Congo, not in Ukraine, not in too many parts of the world. How did we get here, despite all of the efforts that we have made? Well, the idea behind the United Nations is not anything new. We need to understand that there are predecessors. And the predecessor of the United Nations was the League of Nations, which was created after the First World War. And it was an organization that was meant to do exactly the kind of things that the UN hopes to achieve. And we need to understand the League in order to know what is happening at the United Nations. The central theme, the concept that underpinned the League, and that also is the basic building block of the United Nations, is something called collective security. The world had concluded that relations of power, force, brought about war, and this needed to be replaced with legality and cooperation. Collective security, which drew on the concepts of international law going back to Hugo Grotius, and the moral aspirations as expressed by Immanuel Kant in his work Perpetual Peace. Collective security basically wanted to achieve a world that was governed by moral suasion and international law. According to collective security, the concept, that is, the entire international system would act in unity against any possible aggressor, would isolate that aggressor, and through the power of moral suasion would dissuade and suffocate that aggression, and the will of the international community would be expressed through international law. If it failed in its central mission of instituting collective security, the League would not merely be coming up short. It would deem to be a fraud. But this is exactly what happened in 1935, 1936. Mussolini invaded helpless Ethiopia, then called as Abyssinia. The brutality was breathtaking. The League of Nations was not only unable to do anything, the behavior of the Western powers in particular was both impotent and dishonest. The distinguished British historian A.J.P. Taylor said that in 1935, as a consequence, the League died. It proved to be a fraud. But it didn't die actually. Who was one of the people who really tried to save the League? It was someone by the name of Neville Chamberlain. And Neville Chamberlain provided a rationalization that should warn and should frighten us today. And what he said was, yes, collective security has failed, but why don't we concentrate on the lesser things? And we could recapture the moral weight and prestige that the League should have. What moral weight? What prestige? This was 2 years before Munich. Munich should not have surprised people if they look back at what happened in 35, 36. Well, the world descended into war in 1939, and the League of Nations became utterly discredited. So in 1945, when the nations of the world got together they did not want to use the name of the League. It had a bad odor about it. So we called it the United Nations. And this time it was supposed to be universal. But it started with an original sin. That original sin was the veto power of 5 permanent members. In short, that makes 5 countries that sit on the Security Council the only body in the UN that has the power to pass binding resolutions under Chapter 7. Those 5 countries are above the law. Everyone else, in essence, is a second-class citizen. It undermines the very concept of collective security. It cannot really function. And the United Nations failed time and again. As the late Abba Eban said, the United Nations was like an umbrella that closed at the first sign of rain. And in 2014, there was a major test, one of many, but this was the final test in the 21st century, the blatant invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the annexation of Crimea, a complete violation of international law, and the international community did nothing really about it, passed sanctions, but it could not reverse it. So in a sense, the United Nations died. And what are we left with? We're left with a Chamberlainian kind of explanation. What about all the other things, all the other good things the United Nations does? Well, my colleagues are going to speak about specifics, but let me just touch on 3 things and say a couple of things. First, any organization is a package. You cannot cherry pick. And if you have the United Nations that is pivoted on the concept of collective security, if you take that out, you really have no core to that organization. But what about all those functional things that the United Nations does? Well, second, let me tell you about some of those functional things. Well, we know about the General Assembly that Patrick Moynihan called the theater of the absurd. But then there is the United Nations Human Rights Council, with luminaries such as Cuba, Saudi Arabia, China. This is where the repressive meets the ridiculous. They have a universal periodic review where they look at human rights, where countries like Libya praise Saudi Arabia for improving human rights. This is an organization that has NGOs attached to it, including one called the Foundation 21st. I guess it stands for the 21st century. This is the one that awarded a prize for human rights, a $250,000 prize. It's called the Gaddafi Prize for International Rights. You can't make this up. And who were some of the recipients? Well, one was the racist Louis Farrakhan. The other one was the Holocaust denier, Roger Godary. Now, what about the organizations in the UN, the specialized organizations that seem more worthy? And they do try. But look at the International Court of Justice. It is so heavily politicized that many have said it is not international, it is not a court, and it's not about justice. Or the World Health Organization. It spent last year over $200 million on travel, first class for its executives, $200 million, which is more than it spent combined on combating AIDS, malaria, and other major diseases. By comparison, Doctors Without Borders spent something like $37 million, and they have more than 30,000 volunteers. So what has happened in essence is that we've seen a hijacking of human rights, an abandoning of the principle of collective security, and we have a Chamberlainian organization that tells us the specific things that are gold-plated should compensate for losing the centrality of what the United Nations was about. And this is one of the key problems, that when you have the loss of collective security, the prevention of war, ensuring peace, international legality, when you hijack human rights, it all pains reason and equity. When you have the failure in 2014 that starkly illustrates what the United Nations has become, then you have a situation where the world has a right to say to all those who defend, with well-intentioned United Nations, there is an opportunity cost. You are preventing a debate about real alternatives. It is time to say enough. The United Nations has proved that it's not a reformable organization. We need to change. After 2014, the world deserves better. Thank you.
And Marissa, over to you again.
I hope that you're all thinking in your heads, oh, I have so much to say at the party tonight over several glasses of wine. So the next speaker is John Robson. He's a columnist with the National Post and a talk radio contributor, and believes we shouldn't place much stock in the United Nations. John.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a marvelous conference. I think I may, to some extent, be rowing against the current here, or possibly straight up a waterfall, because I have no dazzling disruptions to offer you. I don't know that I want to live forever on the moon with titanium bones, eating hamburgers made from plants and having ears made from plants. On the other hand, I am crowdfunded. I, too, have a Patreon, although unlike Butterscotch, I couldn't play a trumpet even if I had one up on stage, never mind if I didn't. But I'm not here to cast a pall of gloom over an eternity of Riemann surface tennis and centrifugal bumble puppy. I'm here to cast a pall of gloom over the United Nations, to ask, what is this thing? It certainly is, rhetorically at least, a cornerstone of Canadian foreign policy. We love multilateralism. Nothing is more multilateral than the United Nations, and we tend to endorse it without giving a whole lot of thought to what we're saying, which is a bit of a habit in Canadian foreign policy, what Roy Rempel's called dreamland. Our foreign minister just gave a major speech on the anniversary of D-Day. Apparently soft power is out. She didn't say where it came from, but something else is in. And in the course of that speech, she said, force is, of course, always a last resort. Well, if force is a last resort, then the second last one is ignominious surrender, right? It's an ordinal ranking. It's the last one. You never do it. I'm not sure she was thinking very hard when she said it. I don't know how that got past a whole committee of speechwriters. But I do want to try and think a little bit about the UN, clearly and fundamentally. And my time is short, so I need to talk fast. Do you have a question about the UN as well? Not that fast. The question of what the UN is, I'm tempted in the spirit of Candide to say it's an organization devoted to driving us insane, especially arguably those who place the most hope in it. Robert Conquest once said the best way to explain the behavior of any large organization is to assume it is secretly controlled by a cabal of its enemies. And the UN is forever feeding its critics with outrageous stories. But it is a meeting place for illegitimate sovereign states. That's what happens at the United Nations. That's who gathers there. There are some legitimate sovereign states, like Canada, that go there, but most of them are not. And that is why the UN is openly contemptuous of human rights. It is a collection of governments that are themselves openly contemptuous of human rights, including the right not to be governed without your consent. But I think what really matters here isn't what the UN is, it's what it's not. Oh, sorry, I want to say yes. Conrad Black called it the now perversely corrupt and absurd United Nations, a primal scream therapy center for the world's most egregious despotisms and kleptocracies. Which reminds me of that line from Star Trek II, don't mince words, Bones. What do you really think? And since you ask what I thought in 1999, when someone said you're more likely to see the UN building dismantled brick by brick and thrown into the Atlantic than to see NATO pilots go before a UN tribunal, I said, so some good may come of this after all. Quoted Abba Eban, I'll quote David Ben-Gurion, whose response to the whole thing was schmoom. And the problem is, I say, it's what the UN is not. The UN is not a world government. The UN is not the conscience of mankind or its police force. And the UN is not a better place to make decisions than Parliament Hill. Our foreign policy is premised on the fact that it is a world government, that it is the conscience and police force of mankind, and that it's a better place to make decisions than Parliament Hill. And those are all wrong. You might think that the second combines 2 points, that it's not the conscience or police force of mankind, but really, they are two sides of the same phenomenon. Because a government is an entity that claims and enforces a monopoly on the legitimate use of force within a jurisdiction, which in this case would be the planet Earth. It's a body with a legislature, an executive, which has to include that police force, and a judiciary. And ideally, and we are blessed to enjoy this here in Canada, it is an entity that enjoys the consent of its people. And manifestly, the UN does none of these things. It's not a government at all. It's a good thing, too. I don't want a world government. My favorite line about this comes from Milton Friedman, from a conference where Bertrand Juvenal told Friedman that he'd always been an ardent advocate of world government until the day he crossed the border into Switzerland ahead of the pursuing Nazis. National sovereignty is a good thing in an imperfect world. It means there can be places that are relatively good, even in a world much of which is not relatively good. Refugees come to Canada. They couldn't do that if there wasn't a Canada, could they? It is a good thing that Canada is a sovereign entity. And if we did have a world government, by the way, if it was the size of the British House of Commons, which I think is the upper size for an effectively functioning legislature, there would be all the legislators and we'd be the three little red dots. We would have no say in the affairs of the world or in the affairs of Canada. Why would we want that? What's so wrong with Canada that we would like to give up our right to make the rules under which we live? Including in that speech by our foreign minister, and I don't agree with all of this, but that's a subject for another day. She is talking about how our foreign policy is based on feminism, safe and accessible abortions. These abortions apparently at the core of our foreign policy. I can think of things I'd rather see there, but a great many governments that are present at the United Nations don't share these goals. If we were in that parliament I showed you, these would not be our goals. So even from her own point of view, it would be a bad thing. If we did have an effective world government, what would we gain? What suggestion that is made at the United Nations can we not adopt right now if it's a good one? What bad idea suggested there can we not reject as things stand? What alliance or treaty can we not make if it is in our interest as a sovereign nation and as people? Is it all about a vague feeling of moral superiority? Robert Frost once said that a liberal is a man so broad-minded he won't take his own side in a quarrel. And I sometimes feel that our government feels that way, that there is something dirty about standing up for Canada. Well, I have a rather different view of the matter. Now, time being so short, I don't want to go through what the UN is actually like. This is a thing they tweeted about some girl in Gaza whose life is made miserable by Israeli occupation or blockade. However, as they knew perfectly well, it's actually from Syria. Its agencies are corrupt beyond belief. The World Health Organization deliberately holds, especially on the subject of Israel, positive news, and anti-Semitism is a real canary in a coal mine here. It even passed a Security Council resolution saying that there was no legal connection between Israel and East Jerusalem, also known as Old Jerusalem. So the Security Council, 14 in favor, Barack Obama's United States abstaining, said, yeah, basically there never was a temple on the Temple Mount. This is not an organization that has any moral legitimacy, in my view. And then, yeah, Saudi Arabia is on the Human Rights Council. It's also on ECOSOC's Commission on the Status of Women, and Sudan is on ECOSOC's Committee on Non-Governmental Organizations. The rot goes from top to bottom. So the UN is not a world government. Canada wouldn't be better off if it was a world government. Our self-government is built on the rock of Magna Carta. So I leave you with the words of Edward Cook in his great parliamentary speech in 1628 on the Petition of Right. He said, "This nation has a law appropriate to the kingdom. If you tell me of other laws, you are gone." Well, so is my time, and I wish the United Nations were as well. Thank you. I'm going to, okay, sorry.
Thanks, John. Our next speaker is Geoffrey Clarfield. He's an anthropologist. He has 20 years of international experience. He's worked with the UN twice, so I think he has a thing or two to say about it. He's also the executive director of the Mozood Freedom Foundation. Why don't we welcome him to the stage?
Thanks so much. Good afternoon. I take friends to the Serengeti every year for 10 to 12 days to see what I think is the most beautiful part of the world. And you may wonder why I started my presentation with my hobby and my avocation, because today, ladies and gentlemen, I'm taking you on a UN corruption safari around the world. So let's start over here in Washington, and let's see if within 7 minutes I can get to the other side of the room. The World Health Organization in 2009, if you remember, told us that a world pandemic was happening, that everyone was going to get the flu, and so many people were going to die. It reminded me of stories of my great-grandfather from 1919, when a quarter of Europe and a lot of North Americans died. It was the H1N1 epidemic, if you remember. Pandemic, which is more than an epidemic. What happened is that I got vaccinated. I really hate going to the doctor. And they spent hundreds of millions of dollars. The British Medical Journal the next year evaluated. They found out that all the medical experts and the doctors were on the payrolls of the pharmaceutical companies. And as a result, it's possible that there really wasn't a pandemic. Their experts got a pile of money. The pharma companies made gazillions, trillions, and the whole thing was a sham. So I want an apology. That's just one example of hundreds of millions gone. So let's move from Washington and let's fly to Paris, the center of culture. Paris, the Tour Eiffel. I love Paris. What a great city. And that's, of course, where the UN, those smart, crafty men and women, put UNESCO, because who can say that if you establish a UN organization which deals with culture and science in Paris, that you're doing something wrong? The restaurants are great and the music is fantastic. And so UNESCO spends most of its time denying history. And the history it denies is biblical history. They're spending most of their time making sure that they try and persuade us there's no connection between Jews, Israel, the Old Testament, the Bible, any of that stuff that you can get at U of T down the road in Biblical Archaeology 100. But that's not the story, because this is about money. The story is Irina Bukova, a former Bulgarian communist, a regime that only disappeared 250,000 of its people, who's the head of that. And meanwhile, she just bought real estate in London and New York worth $4 to $6 million, which is about 30 gazillion times more than she makes. So underneath what's going on in the UNESCO is a money grab. So let's move from Paris and let's go to Iraq, a troubled country. Now remember Saddam Hussein. And after the first Gulf War, there was a humanitarian outcry led by Bill Clinton that all these sanctions against Saddam Hussein were causing terrible suffering to the average Iraqi people. That was true. And so they developed the UN Oil for Food program. And Iraq was allowed to sell oil and use that money to buy food for poor Iraqis. Paul Volcker from the Federal Reserve evaluated it later on and found out that 250 name companies, people who put the soap in your detergent, for example, gave Saddam Hussein $1.8 billion of kickbacks. And that's Iraq. So let's move down a little farther south to Somalia. Somalia is a beautiful country. It's a fabulous desert place with these fantastic nomadic tribesmen who've been living traditional lives as camel herders, but erupted from within Al-Shabaab, which in Arabic means the gang. And that's how they behave. They're ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, Somali style, and they're causing a horrible problem there. So the World Food Program of the UN has convoys that go in from the coast into the interior where the fighting is going on, and a 2014 evaluation showed that, about $100 million of money and food went to Al-Shabaab, because the farther you get away from the coast and the government, the more you have to pay bakshish and bribery. So the UN and the World Food Program were actually subsidizing Al-Shabaab. And so they're actually making the war in Somalia worse. So let's jump down a little farther south to Kenya, Nairobi, a city that was my home for many years. I love it dearly. Wonderful people, great place. Garden City in the sun. UNEP, started by a Canadian, Maurice Strong, the United Nations Environmental Program. Well, if World Health is concerned with our health, and UNESCO with our culture, and World Food with, starvation, well, that's the thing for the environment. And the environment is the biggest thing, of course, because we live in it. And in 2005, UNEP was a very small organization. It was like a cheap cousin. And they latched on to climate change. And on their website, they predicted that by 2010, 7 years ago, there would be 50 million climate refugees from places like the Caribbean and the Pacific, and islands would be overrun. It would be kind of like a Dennis Hopper Waterworld kind of situation. And clearly that didn't happen. So imagine being at UNEP 2006, 2007, 2008. They're having meetings. They're really suffering, because they don't want to lose those $250,000 tax-free salaries that they get, plus children's subsidized education at the best schools. So they disappeared. They disappeared the data. And some very smart journalists at Singapore realized that Google caches documents. So if you go on the internet, you'll get about 300 pages of hilarious dialogue. So let's jump from Kenya. Let's fly all the way over to North Korea, where in the 90s, the UNDP, I don't know what it does, but it says it does development. The United Nations Development Program had a very expensive project with North Korea, with Kim Il-jong #1, and $100 million disappeared, supporting the family of Kim Il-jong. So that money went to the North Koreans. The UNDP violated all its rules, all its regulations, and basically supported a rogue regime that's sending missiles against our allies. Finally, I've gone around the world in 7.5 minutes, I hope. And here we are back in Washington, D.C., where we have the World Bank. Now, the World Bank is supposed to be the good guys. They're in charge of our financial health. They're the guys with the spreadsheets, and the gals, and the IMF, and they have strange projects which have nothing to do with finance, like participatory rural appraisal. Does anyone know what that is? I'm an expert in it, but that's another lecture. In the 1990s, an investigative journalist named Catherine Caulfield did a major expose called Masters of Illusion. And she found out that according to the World Bank itself, they evaluated their projects at a 40% success rate. That's an internal evaluation. That's like me evaluating how good I was as an undergraduate student. I'm sure it was not as good as, or far less than my professors thought. So I'd like to finalize by suggesting that when you go to each one of the institutions of the United Nations, you find corruption, you find nepotism, and in some situations, you find a terrible creation. As Ivan Illich once said, an iatrogenic disease, like we see in Somalia, the creation of greater suffering, greater war, greater disease than if they hadn't been there in the first place. So I think with regards to United Nations, we have to realize that the safari that I just took you on was paid by you and paid by me because everything in the United Nations comes from our taxpayers' dollars. I think our taxpayers' dollars may go somewhere better if we only think about it. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Our last speaker will be a familiar face to most of you, the Reverend Majed El Shafie, the founder of One Free World International, and of course, a human rights advocate. Majed.
Thank you very much for having me again. I don't know why I'm in this panel. Quite honestly, I'm the least expert about the UN. For me, it's very simple. UN is standing for United Nothing. This is just to keep it simple. Actually, I don't see the UN have good or have bad. I just can see both sides. And we have to admit, and me personally, through my experience in the UN, first time I dealt with the UN, I dealt with the UN as a refugee, as a UN refugee from UNHCR in Israel. And this organization saved my life, it's true. So I cannot sit down and I can criticize that everything in the UN is bad. I don't believe that. I believe that there is good, there is the bad, but I believe that we have to bring accountability for the bad. And we have to mention the good and we have to be thankful to the good, but in the same time we have to to understand that the UN is just the image, or supposed to project what our world's supposed to be, a better world, a future full of democracy. Now, when we're talking about the UN, even when in my trips overseas, include the Middle East and Asia, when I'm sitting down with a simple person, I can see that the UN disconnected from reality. And the people have no trust in this organization. I'm talking about simple people. I'm not talking about big organizations. I'm not talking about big money. I'm talking about simple people in the street, that they actually need the UN service, and the UN was made to serve them. The disconnection from that is really very disturbing. And if there is two areas I will focus on, the failure of the UN with the peacekeeping missions, and the destruction and the corruption of the UN itself. With the first part, with the peacekeeping mission, if we are looking at Cambodia, 1975 to 75 to 79, all the way to Yugoslavia, 91, all the way to Somalia, 93, all the way to Darfur, 94, all the way to what's happened recently in 2014, the Yazidi genocide. We see that the UN show up late after millions of people was killed and massacred, or they were there and they didn't do anything about it. And the opposite, their soldiers just evacuate the officials and evacuate themselves and leave the civilians facing the fire alone. And this is a problem because the very people that you are supposed to protect, you are leaving them behind to be killed. And you are showing up after a genocide taking place, month after that, and you're saying we are here to make a difference. Which kind of difference? The people is already being killed. The genocide already been taking place. You defeated your own purpose. You are existing for the wrong purpose then. And moving from the structure of the UN itself, I found it disturbing to me when we're talking about the the five-member veto. Just recently, in the recent history, we found that the UN completely was dysfunctional when it came to Syria, when it came to Ukraine, when it came to North Korea, even when it came to Iran. Many young Iranian people died in the Iranian Revolution. The Green Revolution is called the Green Revolution. The UN didn't do anything about it. That's because these 5 countries will use the veto. If we're talking about true democracy, this veto have to disappear. When we're talking about Russia and China, that they have the right to use this veto to stop every good work of the UN, so what's the purpose of it? Dismantle the veto rights is something essential in order to continue trusting in the UN. Moving from there, the Human Rights Council, and I just would like to echo what other speakers said. When we see in the UN, the Human Rights Council, when we see seats for Libya, Saudi Arabia have a seat in the Human Rights Council. Saudi Arabia, the woman cannot drive in Saudi Arabia. I need you to explain, I need you to understand that. They are debating right now, that's not a joke. They are debating right now if she can ride a donkey. They are debating right now if she rides a donkey. And my opinion, if she can ride her husband, she can ride a donkey. Sorry, I didn't mean to insult the donkeys. I'm sorry about that. But in the same area, the bias against Israel, and just hold on a second before you jump in my face and like, oh, you are pro-Israel. No, I'm not pro-Israel, I'm just anti-stupid. And I'm an Egyptian, so I can speak about Israel as I wish. You know, you call me whatever you want to call me. But the truth and the reality, there is 77 resolutions be released against Israel between 2006 to 2014. And there is only one against Hamas as a terrorist organization. That's nonsense. That's absolutely nonsense. Hamas is killing their own people, is against women's rights, against all principles and values, and there is only one resolution against Hamas, and 77 against Israel. The bottom line here is, in order for us to trust the UN again, We have to disband the five members veto, and we have to bring accountability. Nobody above the law. Thank you. Sit down here. Right.
So we'll have a bit of a discussion about this now, because while I think we're in agreement that there's much corruption in the United Nations, I think we may disagree a little bit on what should be done about it. Do we dismantle this institution? Do we reform it? Do we replace it? So why don't I throw it out to each of you, and we can start with you, Aurel. Is this an institution? I know certain affiliated bodies have been called to be dismantled, but what do we do here?
Well, you mentioned the word corruption, and of course we all are appalled by corruption, but corruption is not the fundamental problem with the United Nations. The fundamental problem is that it has betrayed its guiding central principle. So to talk about all of the other elements of the United Nations, it's sort of like that rather morbid joke about the assassination of Lincoln. According to this joke, after President Lincoln was assassinated, the director went up to Mrs. Lincoln and said, well, Mrs. Lincoln, outside of this unfortunate development with your husband, how did you really enjoy the play? Well, if you take out collective security, nothing else really matters. All of that can be done by other organizations for less. Now, the problem is, can the UN be reformed? And sadly, there are some organizations that simply are not reformable. And I've looked at the United Nations for a great many years. In the structure, the veto power, the absence of collective security, make this an organization like the Soviet Union was. Gorbachev tried to reform what proved to be the unreformable. The United Nations, sadly, has become unreformable. It needs to be replaced or abandoned. The functional organizations can be replaced themselves with more efficient, less costly, not gold-plated organizations. All of those things, whether it is traffic or healthcare, can be done better and for less. Now, is the United Nations a kind of mirror on the world? Yes, it is in a sense. It is a world where most countries are not democracies. It's a sad reality. But do we need to have a mirror this expensive? Do we need to provide a forum where the worst dictatorships lecture the world's democracies, where there is this kind of theater of absurd that is so costly, so repugnant, so legitimizes the worst instincts of dictators and of dictatorships?
Well, I'm still on the brick-by-brick side of the story. If you think about reforming the UN, you'd have to say, what is it that it's meant to be? Because we're going to reform it into the shape it's meant to have. Now, one possibility, because the UN grew out of the wartime alliance, which was not a collective security organization at all, it was a mutual defense pact. It was not an organization of states that agreed to protect one another from an attack from somebody inside it. It was a bunch of people who would be at each other's throats if they hadn't been attacked by Adolf Hitler, and banded together because they were Stalin's Soviet Union with Churchill's Britain and Canada and so on. So what would you make the UN into so that the current obnoxious aspects of it would be bugs, not features? Because right now it's a gathering of illegitimate states, and it acts exactly like that. You look at the corruption at the UN. Well, imagine the corruption within the governments of most of its member states. This is how they do things. This is an organization that reflects its membership with ghastly accuracy. And so what would you replace it with? Well, in some sense, I'd replace it with NATO. There's a legitimate gathering of roughly like-minded states to protect one another against external attack. But everything else, the humanitarian stuff that the UN does, it does very badly. It siphons off the money. It politicizes it. It is filled with an insane anti-Semitism that colors virtually everything that it does. And then people think, oh, yeah, there's a crisis in the world, but it's okay because the UN is on the job. You know, forget I'm from the government in here to help you. This is 10 times worse. And it blinds us to the fact that there could be other responses. So I say get rid of it because it does harm in what it actually does, and it does harm by the illusion it creates about things that are happening that aren't happening, and in a great many cases shouldn't. So just brick by brick into the Atlantic and no replacement.
Well, Majed, you said that the UN, there is some good that's done by the UN. So do you believe that it could possibly be reformed in the way that it needs to be?
I believe it can be reformed, but here is the tricky part. It takes a village. So all the, like even if we replace it by NATO, NATO is not perfect either, quite honestly. Like, and NATO will have similar problems. The issues here that I'm seeing, it takes a village. Like we can see Donald Trump, you like him, you hate him, that's not the point. The point that the guy said the UN is a club. He said it. While our prime minister coming, and even with the Yazidi issue, he's counting on the UN to do everything. I didn't vote for the UN, I voted for a Canadian government. So the truth and the reality, it takes a village. All the countries that from democratic countries, free countries, have to stand up and say, this will not work, we have to change that. The change of the UN will not come within because they are in a comfortable cushion. It has to come from outside as a pressure.
Is it conceivable that a major Western country, call it the US, could pull out of the UN? And if so, Geoffrey, would it continue to be the UN? Does it lose its legitimacy? What happens then?
It's conceivable that a strong democratic country lying somewhere to the south of us may pull out of the UN. I would encourage it, but I want to focus on the here and now for a moment, ladies and gentlemen. Is if Jordan Peterson was on the stage with us right now, he'd remind us that the UN is behaving like an evil organization. I won't do the Dr. Evil thing for the moment. Truly and profoundly, it does more harm than it does good. I disagree with my friend Majed. And evil has a dynamic. Evil gets worse, as we saw in World War II and we saw in the Soviet Union. And where I would put the emphasis is on our school system. The UN has a plan, they really do, and I can show it, and I've written about it, to infiltrate our school system. They want to replace our curriculum, and this mania for model UNs in all our high schools across the nation is just an example of that. So I want to protect my country. You know, as a Canadian who loves Canadian democracy, the UN is so pernicious and dynamic that we really have no choice but to push back, because if we don't, in a sense, it's beginning to set our agenda. And if it sets the educational agenda of our children, I think as the head of the Jesuits, Thomas Loyola, said, give me your children and I'll give you their future, we're in that frightening situation. So, you know, Aurel and John and Majed may talk about the macro, but I see it as coming to a theater next to you. I don't want to go to that film or send my children there. Thank you.
Well, you raise a good point. I'll let you speak in 1 second, Aurel. I'm curious, then what is the future of this institution, especially if its primary funding is coming from major Western countries and they're threatening to cut it? What happens?
There is something called an opportunity cost. When you're spending a huge amount of money on the UN, it kind of sucks up the oxygen. You can't re-spend it on other organizations. Whatever they do is gold-plated. It is governed by a kind of ideology. What Geoffrey is referring to is that the UN doesn't engage in education. It engages in indoctrination. And that is something very, very different. And you do see those clubs at high school. You see it at universities, whether when I was teaching at Harvard or at the University of Toronto, you see the model UN clubs. They have all these conferences. They seem innocuous, but they are part of an indoctrination where they accept this kind of Chamberlainian notion that you could have a meaningful international organization without the central purpose of it, without what it's supposed to achieve. That is, a world that is governed by international law and morality, where you don't use force, but use the power of moral suasion. If you failed in that, everything else is peripheral. And consequently, I think you have to let go of the United Nations. What could replace it? Well, there could be possibly a kind of unity or united democracies. But democracies represent fewer than half of the world. And so there needs to be a transformation of the world. So when Immanuel Kant talked about perpetual peace, he envisioned a world that was made up of republics, or will be democracies today. So the promotion of democracy is absolutely crucial. Language, education, all these things are essential. And when we look at that, the United Nations is not some organization that promotes that. It is an obstacle. It is a subterfuge. And this is why I took you back to the 1920s and then Chamberlain in the 1930s, because what he said, his rationalization, that sordid sort of excuse, is what should really frighten us.
I'll let John have the final word.
Well, I think that if Western governments were to cut their funding, the UN would do what it does now, but on a smaller scale. And that would be a very practical step forward. But the UN isn't going to change. It's going to be what it is for as long as it exists. And the world isn't going to change in the way you describe. I don't know if original sin was invited into the conference hall, but it tends to go everywhere people are. And we will never have a world with peace and universal harmony and love as long as people are the way they are. And this is why, you have to keep your powder dry. And that's what NATO is for. When I talk about NATO replacing the UN, I don't mean NATO doing what the UN now does. I mean that we protect ourselves through NATO from a dangerous world. And we protect ourselves from the illusion that the world has become less dangerous, more united, more loving, and less flawed because there is this organization whose virtually every act and deed reinforces the fact that it's not what we think it is. It's not the conscience of mankind. It's not a world government. It's not the New Jerusalem. It's a place where corrupt, illegitimate, aggressive sovereign states meet to behave exactly the way they meet at home on a world stage. And it will never be anything other than that.
Ladies and gentlemen, these men are available later to debate. That's it.
Maybe